Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the fifth episode of my Ships of War series. That being the series in which I look at historical warships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious, and have a look at them in their historical context, but also how they are represented in some of the games that I own. And today it is with some trepidation that I'm embarking on this one. I am going to be comparing USS Iowa with HIJMS Yamato. So, why trepidation? Well, these two ships cannot help but be incredibly famous. They both have enormous fan bases, and you don't have to look too far to find books that have been published. Many websites dedicated to the memory of these ships, a lot of them supported by the most superb research that can be carried out, and then of course no shortage of YouTube channels devoted to these ships, either singly or well, let's just say, out of curiosity, I did a quick YouTube hunt and I found that loads of people have got there before me on the $64,000 question of what would happen if one of the Iowas and one of the two Yamatos had ever met in battle. So I'm going to be tackling this rather interesting question. Just so you know, I will not be going into as much details as a lot of these studies have done, because as I say, my purpose is more to deal in the generalities and also to keep in sight my objective, which is to look at how these two ships have been represented in the game Fire in the Sky, the Great Pacific War, which I've only recently reviewed. So, as usual, I'm going to say a bit about the history of the two vessels, um, and then proceed to look at the statistics that the game has given them, how it's treated them in general, and whether I think the game's conclusions are fair in terms of what we know of the historical reality. Now, of course, even with well documented ships, a lot of this will be open to interpretation, and Iowa and Yamato are quite a contrast because, of course, as far as is possible, no ship has a perfect historical record behind her, but the Iowa is much better documented than the Yamato. Now, that's not to say we don't know much about the Yamato. We do now. Despite Japanese efforts to destroy some material at the end of the war, a remarkable amount of information relating to the Yamato survived. And as more is translated from Japanese sources, more information is beginning to come available. And there have been some excellent books published in just the last couple of years dealing with these ships. So, as I say, I'm going to stick to the basics and let's see how we go. So to start with, what has Fire in the Sky done with these ships? So I'm going to turn them over because, of course, this is the deactivated. Sorry, Iowa. This is the deactivated side for the ships, and also, as you can see, Fire in the Sky groups capital ships in pairs. So Yamato is here with her sister Musashi, and Iowa is there with the New Jersey. But you can treat these figures as effectively relating to one ship. So I'm going to turn them over because, beautiful though the deactivated side is, it's nice to get a silhouette of a vessel and a slightly clearer sight of the stats. So putting them down again, the number over there is what's called their transport costs. So think of that as an amalgamation of the logistical requirements for running the ship, keeping it supplied, keeping it fueled. It's basically how much it costs the player each turn for the Japanese oil points, for the US transport points, to sort of keep it fed and watered and happy. And looking at the numbers along the bottom row, you see they're divided into two groups. The one on the bottom left is the ship's armament rating, and the first number is the surface combat rating, so 4 for Yamato and 3 for Iowa. And the one next to that is the anti-aircraft rating. So 3 for Yamato and 8 for Iowa. Oh, that's a bit of a whopper. The box to the right contains I'll call it the survivability rating, which is 12 for both ships, basically how much damage they can absorb. And the very last one at bottom right is the speed rating. Yamato's has been aggregated to 6 and Iowa's to 8. So, how fair is this? Well, before I kick off a direct comparison, just a little bit of history, because these ships, while they were contemporaries, and their evolution, if I can call it that, from drawing board to commissioned ship, kind of overlapped. Iowa was a little bit behind the Yamato in entering service. So the Yamato is completed and accepted into the fleet in 1941, even though there's still a lot that's quite secret about her. And as 1942 dawns, she's still being subjected to fairly intensive trials. So she wouldn't have been entering combat, certainly for the first few months of 1942. Iowa joins much later. Well, I say much later. She becomes operational in 1943, and by the end of that year is very much an active fleet unit. So, where did these designs come from? Yamato and Iowa both belong to a stream of strategic thinking whereby both countries were trying to work out in the interwar period how a conflict between them would pan out. And for the Japanese, hobbled as they were by the Washington Naval Treaty, they were attempting to go for a quality over quantity approach. What they meant by that was they wanted to start looking into building super battleships which would outrange and outgun their US counterparts and make up for the disparity in numbers. The Japanese concept of the decisive battle essentially was a repeat of the Tsushima campaign of 1905. They wanted the US fleet to advance across the Pacific towards the home islands where it would be whittled down by aircraft and submarines. But even the more optimistic Japanese calculations believed that following these attritional attacks, they would still be outnumbered by the US battle line. Hence the need for heavier, harder hitting ships. And by the middle of the 1930s, this thinking had begun to coalesce towards what would become the Yamato design. Rather terrifyingly, the Yamatos were only intended to be an interim class on the way to even bigger and scarier things. But to be perfectly honest, reality would probably have stepped in before then. And I personally don't feel Japan had the right level of industrial capacity to produce such monsters. The Yamato class were about as good as it was ever going to get for them. Meanwhile, on the US side, similar discussions were taking place, but the nature of them was slightly different. The genesis of the Iowa class fast battleship could actually be traced to the South Dakotas, which were not in themselves a bad class of battleships, but they were somewhat inadequate to compared to the Iowas. So in about 1936 into 1937, you get the very intensive discussions and design meetings that lead to the finalization of the South Dakota class. But even while that class is being built, it's recognized that something better is going to be needed. And interestingly enough, it shows how forward-thinking the US was being with this. The primary purpose envisioned for the follow-on battleship class would be something fast enough to accompany the fast carrier groups that the US Navy wanted to put together in order to give them heavy support. The US Navy was fairly convinced that the Japanese would form carrier task forces and that they would be backed up by heavy, fast battleships. And the US planners were not wrong, because effectively what happens in the Second World War is that the Japanese used the Congo class very, very heavily as companions for their carrier battle groups. So the US Navy wanted a big, powerful, well-armed battle wagon that was fast enough to be able to jog along with the carriers and not fall behind. Most US battleship classes at the time would have struggled and failed to keep up with ships like the Yorktown class or even Lexington and Saratoga. So come 1938, design work begins on what will ultimately become the Iowa-class battleships. And the two, the ones we're looking at today, Iowa and Yamato, enter service less than 2 years apart from each other. Now, their careers end up being very, very different because with the Iowa class, they emerge and join the US Navy at a time when the tide has very, very much turned against Japan. It's not yet immediately obvious, but the US Navy is beginning to possess this irresistible naval combat power that's going to batter its way steadily across the Pacific. Now, Yamato entered service at a time when the going was extremely good for Japan too. But the strategic concept behind her, unlike that for the US ship, was fatally flawed. The Japanese were still clinging, despite the fact that they had pioneered some seriously important advances in carrier aviation, on the tactical level, on the technological level, even on the strategic level. They were still nursing this idea that the naval showdown would be a decisive battle somewhere near, and that the core of that action would be the battleships. So, like the rest of the so-called Hashirajima fleet, Yamato was carefully husbanded against the day when she would be needed for that decisive battle. Now, compared to that, the US approach with the Iowas was wonderfully flexible. Yes, they spent a good deal of their lives running around at high speed with carrier task forces, occasionally splitting off as they did at during Operation Hailstone, the attack on Truk Lagoon, to close in and finish off any unfortunate Japanese ships that had managed to escape from that death trap, really. And so Iowa gains I think the dubious distinction of squishing the poor Japanese light cruiser Katori, and there's a mismatch if there ever was one. But essentially, the US ship fulfills a variety of roles, including bombardment missions, and also, very importantly, the Iowas proved themselves very worthy command ships. They've got plenty of room for an admiral's staff. They've got brilliant communication suites, and they have really, really excellent radar detection systems. Your situational awareness, if your flag was flying from an Iowa, as an admiral, you would have a really good sense of what was going on around you, or at least as good as could be provided in the mid-1940s. Now, I don't know if this is unfortunate for posterity. It certainly left people many things to debate over. None of the Iowas or the Yamatos met directly. There was one point at which they may have done, and this is the tantalizing thought that when the US Navy became aware of the Yamato's last sortie in April 1945 I'm not sure quite how she was supposed to achieve anything, but assist the garrison of Okinawa, the US Navy had the option of dispatching 1, 2, 3 Iowas to intercept the ship. They did not do this, very sensibly opting for the far more efficient manner of dispatching the Japanese behemoth with aircraft. But what if they had decided to send the Iowas? So that leads me to my next question, which is how does the game portray them, and how fair do I think it's going to be? Well, I'm going to start with the big number there, because the logistical side is actually quite an important one. You're not dealing with small ships here, and one of my pictures has intruded already. There we go. So I'm just going to quickly show up a picture of the Yamato here. This was taken during the battle in the Sibuyan Sea, I think, from a US aircraft. And you can tell from, even though there's no other ships in the picture for comparison, you can see that she's massive. If you fully loaded a Yamato class battleship, she would top off at not very far off 70,000 tons. And I'm talking fully loaded with full fuel, ammunition, crew of 2,500, all her aircraft. That's a big ship. By contrast, the Iowa, which I'll bring in here, there's a nice picture of her in one of the US Navy's floating docks in the Pacific. I think that's at Manus, actually. Fully laden, these vessels would probably approach 57.5, 58,000 tons. So no slouches in the size department, but, still lagging behind this huge Japanese monster over here. And the dimensions sort of speak to it as well. So I'll just linger on this picture of the Iowa. So her length overall would have been 887 feet long. Now this compares to Yamato's length, which was 862 feet, almost 863. So the US ship is longer, but she's slimmer. The maximum beam of the Iowa class is 108 foot, give or take. The maximum beam of the Yamato class is somewhat over 121 feet, so that's a wide ship. So having established how gorgeously big they are, what have they been rated? Now both of them have been rated a 3, which I think is very fair. Both of them were logistics and fuel hogs. Although I'm going to qualify that by saying that I think the Iowas were somewhat more efficient on account of their better machinery. So the Yamato could carry an impressive 6,300 tons of oil in her fuel bunkers if she was fully loaded. That's quite a lot, and she was very heavily topped up for her final sortie. The US ship, by contrast, and bear in mind the hull dimensions I've just run through, was much more efficiently laid out. She had the capacity, maximum fuel stowage, of 7,621 tons of oil. So that is over 1,000 tons more than the Yamato, gives her a much greater range. Now, it's well documented that if she cruised along at 15 knots, which was a good cruising speed, the Iowas would be capable of, stretching out to 10 to 15,000 nautical miles or thereabouts. That's a very long way, without needing to worry too much about refueling. Yamato, I think, would have only approached that if she travelled at a much lower speed. So, a somewhat less efficient ship, but it doesn't alter the fact that the fuel and logistical needs of both vessels were very close. So I think rating them both a 3 is fair. So shall we get on to the thing that everyone is most interested, I'm sure, the armament. And let's look at the surface armament first. So Yamato has been rated a 4 in game terms and Iowa's a 3. I'm not too certain of this rating, and I'm about to go into the reasons why. So Yamato, as completed, I'm going to find another nice, impressive picture of her. When she was first commissioned, her main battery, 3 turrets, was 9 18-inch guns. Well, 18.1 inch if you want to be really precise about it. And that was a significant armament. She was not the first warship to ever carry a gun of that caliber, but she was the first warship in human history to carry that many. And she probably, to be perfectly honest, would, other than Musashi, her sister, would be the last. Alongside those, she was completed with 12 6.1-inch guns mounted in 4 triple turrets. And it's not very obvious in the picture, but if you look around there, I'm not sure I can get this any closer. You can see one of her wing turrets. You can just about, let's get the pen there. You can just make out the shape of it there. The fore and aft ones, well, aft and fore in this case, there we go, aft and fore are much more easy to spot. So she had 4 of those turrets. Now this was later reduced to 2 as the war went on and the realization came that a emphasis on more anti-aircraft weapons was more important. She lost those wing turrets, so slight weakening of the stronger side of her secondary armament. But 9 18-inch was nothing to sneeze at. The equivalent guns on the Iowa were 9 16-inch, and they were arranged in precisely the same efficient way as the Yamato's armament was. Now, backing these up, the US ship had 20 of the US Navy's excellent 5-inch dual-purpose guns. They're pretty much equivalents of the Japanese model, but they're slightly more efficient. And you can see them grouped here in these very space-efficient twin turret mountings. I say turrets, they're really more gun houses. So on paper, the Japanese ship has an advantage because she has a much heavier broadside than the US one and can bring the same number of guns to bear. Certainly if you count the amount of lead she could have in the air from her main battery, it would seem that she has an advantage, and I think that's the thinking behind giving her a 4 to the US 3. But a simple comparison of gun barrels and weight of shell is a somewhat misleading thing, because it's one thing to have the guns. It's something very different entirely to be able to bring them to bear on their target. And this is where, if we take the Okinawa campaign, where Yamato had her primitive radar gear, and she'd had just about every modification that could be crammed into her by that stage in her life. If you assume an Iowa met a Yamato in April 1945, I personally feel that all things being equal, it would actually be the Iowa that had the advantage. And my reason for saying this is, if you're looking purely at the armament, yes, the Yamato has heavier guns. But when you compare the long-range detection systems and the fact that the Iowas enjoyed very well integrated radar-directed gunnery systems, that does have an impact. I have a reasonable amount of confidence that had it come to a gun battle, at longer ranges particularly, the Iowa would probably have begun landing hits first before the Yamato was able to return the favor. Now, of course, one can go endlessly to and fro about the effectiveness of these hits, where a battleship's immune zones are and what the best engagement range is. But thinking purely about landing shells on target, I think the Iowa would have had an advantage. Also, advances in propellant and the quality of shell has an impact too, and I don't mean any pun there, by the way. And US manufacturing was of a higher standard than the Imperial Navy's at this time. So you've got good quality guns on the US ship, good quality shells, probably balanced by good guns on the Japanese ship, but maybe questionable ordnance. It does depend. But couple that up with the US ship's ability to see for its guns better and to guide them more accurately, then the Japanese have a bit of a problem. If it were me designing this game, I would have actually given the Yamatos and the Iowas an equivalent gunnery rating, because once you've boiled everything out, I think they balance each other out. What about the anti-aircraft rating? The mighty Yamato seems to have been shortchanged a bit with just a 3. But again, I think this is fair for very much the same reasons. So if you look at the Japanese battleship, I'll get the Shibuyan Sea picture back. She looks very impressive. She's absolutely studded with anti-aircraft guns, and this was taken in 1944. So of course it's post the alteration where she's lost her wing surface weapon turrets, and she's had a lot more AA stuffed in. So by the time this photograph is taken, and by April 1945, she would have had 24 5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin mountings. This was an excellent gun. The problem the Japanese had was that its guidance systems, again, compared to the US Navy, Japanese anti-aircraft guidance systems belonged to a somewhat earlier generation and were not as effective. You could put up a decent box barrage for area denial, but that doesn't always help you against tactical aircraft. In addition to this, the ship had received large numbers of the Japanese Navy's 25mm cannons and 13.2mm machine guns. The 25mm was all right as a gun in terms of its ballistics and all that, but it was ridiculously short-ranged for the kind of war that was being fought by 1945. And if you want to point out something particularly depressing for the Japanese, the Dauntless dive bomber, which by this point in the war, 1945, again had been largely replaced in frontline service by the Hell diver, even a Dauntless of 1942 vintage was able to release its bomb outside the effective range of the Japanese 25mm gun. So, I mean, not that the US Navy was aware of this at the time, but largely speaking, the Japanese light AA weapons were lots of sound and fury, but they signified very little. Now compare this to the US ship, which has a much more effective anti-aircraft suite. I'd mentioned the 25-inch dual-purpose guns. These could engage surface targets. They could just as happily knock planes out of the sky. Again, US radar and radar guidance is an invaluable resource for these ships in the anti-aircraft role. And just to make things even harder for Japanese pilots, the invention and implementation of the proximity fuse for the 5-inch gun meant that the US warships didn't even have to score direct hits on Japanese planes anymore. They could just get a near miss, and that would be enough to blow them out the sky. In addition to that, Iowa was completed, and I say completed, in 1943 with 60 of the excellent 40mm Bofors guns and another 60 of the excellent 20mm Oerlikons, which despite their smaller caliber were actually a better gun than the Japanese 25mm. And as the war went on, the great length and size of these ships, plus the ability of the US to churn out a lot of these effective weapons, meant that they were armed for bear by 1945. The captains of the Iowa class could add loads and loads of extra weapons to their ships without too much of a detrimental effect on stability. It did become a problem towards the end of the war, but they could just about get away with it. So with those considerations in mind, I think that the relative anti-aircraft ratings are fair. It's again one of those cases where number of barrels is not a good basis for a comparison. You have to look at all the other factors too. What about survivability? They break even here. This is a very tough one to answer because there is so much if, buts, maybes. I've heard of people actually finding Professor Oken's armor penetration calculator online and running the numbers to see whether Yamato or Iowa would have sunk each other. You can go down that route, and it's a very valid line of inquiry. But that site deals very accurately with armor thicknesses, but it also cautions you that you have to adjust your data for quality of metal work, which is a very difficult thing to quantify. So let's do a straight comparison. Yamato had an armored belt running for most of the hull, and it was angled at about 20 degrees to the vertical, so that increases its protective power. Now, most of this belt was a hugely impressive 16 or so inches of armor. That's very solid backing, and it compares very favorably with the Iowa's 12 or so inches of belt armor. But, again, this but, not only was US metallurgy probably ahead of Japan's, or certainly there. Actually, I'll qualify that. I'll say the USA's ability to churn out quality plating in greater bulk was better than Japan's. But there was also the fact that they weren't just, we're not just comparing good quality steel plates here, because the Iowa's armor was all backed with special tensile steel, which for less than an inch of extra backing greatly increased its protective properties. So again, the bare numbers don't tell you everything. Yamato wins out by a clear margin in terms of armored deck plating as well. So her deck armor at its thickest was 9 and a smidge inches, which is incredibly thick for deck armor. Iowa's tops out as a maximum of 6 inches, but again, there's that special tensile steel backing which ups it in a fairly invisible fashion. The turrets are where the numbers get truly scary. So Yamato's turrets at their thickest enjoyed 25.5 inches of armor, tapering down to 7 and a bit inches at their thinnest. The equivalent numbers for the US ship were 19.7 inches of armor, and that was on the face, narrowing down to the roof, which was the thinnest at 7.25 inches of armor. So for thickness, Yamato's turrets score much better than the US ship. But again, this is probably offset by quality, and we could go down the rabbit hole of arguing about armor distribution, but it's safe to say that both ships' vitals were reasonably well protected, at least in terms of what could be designed at the time. They were very good armor and protection layouts. Now, I've mentioned quality of metal and workmanship a couple of times. Yamato did have problems. And actually, it was more to do with fastenings from the looks of it. So her design, particularly the way armor was integrated into the anti-torpedo defensive scheme, was really good in theory, but it was somewhat lacking in the execution. So when you look at Japanese sources, particularly Yamato survivors who comment on the effects of the hits, it does appear that the connection of the belt armor to the torpedo bulkhead was not as good as it should have been, which is actually a major flaw when one comes to think about withstanding damage. And also the inboard bulkheads, which were supposed to have done a great deal to minimize underwater damage, did not perform as well as they were expected to. And the proof is in the pudding in a way. So Yamato, as the older of the Yamato class, is believed to have been sunk by between 9 and 13 torpedoes in April 1945. And possibly 10 or fewer bombs. Accounts vary. Now compare this with her slightly better built sister, Musashi, who ate 19 torpedoes and somewhat around 30 bombs before succumbing in 1944. Yamato didn't do well. She could have been unlucky. The placement of those hits probably was a major factor. But it is a matter of some record from the Japanese side that her protection scheme did not perform as well as it should have done. So, that said, and all things being equal, you cannot deny that Yamato was a very well protected ship, and probably, certainly in the top 5 of the world's best protected battleships of World War II. So for all the problems, there was not that much to complain about. And actually, all that happens is that the problems are offset her advantage in armor thickness. And so rather than giving her a clear lead over the Iowa, which in theory she should have had, it does shrink her to a parity, which is what we have here in the game. So the very last thing I'm going to look at is their relative speed. So the Iowa's been rated an 8 and Yamato a 6. Again, I think this is a fair one. When Yamato was designed, 30 knots would have been lovely, but realistically, on a vessel of this displacement and the machinery the Japanese were able to build for her, a maximum speed of 27 knots was actually astoundingly good. Now, Yamato could push to 27 and hold it for a while, but most of the time she'd probably jog along at closer to 24 or 25, because as ever, sea state has an effect on these things. And one never wants to push machinery to its limits for long periods unless one has to. The Iowa did much better in this regard. She was designed to make 32.5 knots maximum speed. In service, it was found that the ship could reach 30 knots and hold it for ages under a lot of different conditions. So let's say a 3 to 5 knot speed advantage over the Yamato, which is very, very significant. I mean, maybe by giving Yamato a speed come range of 6 versus 8 is maybe selling the Japanese battleship a little bit short. But I think what's being factored into there as well is the limitations of Japanese logistics, which is another hidden aspect that can reduce the effectiveness of what's otherwise a good warship design. Now, we don't have that many accounts of what it was like to serve aboard the Yamato or the Musashi as we would like. There are certainly books published, but a lot of them focus on the final missions of both ships. And so, we make what you will of that. They're valuable resources, but we know a lot more about what the Iowas were like in service. And by all accounts, the Iowas were comfortable ships. They were popular with their crews. They were also surprisingly maneuverable despite the great length and the slimness of their hull. In fact, if you want to get a sense of how slim an Iowa could be, there's this lovely bows-on photo. And when you think of the size of these ships, that is a very slim-looking battleship. Again, compare it to the significantly tubbier Yamato, and you can see there's quite a difference there. So surprisingly maneuverable for what they were dimensionally, and maybe it's that maneuverability, a consequence of the very, very well designed twin rudder arrangement they had in contrast to the Yamato's single large rudder with a supporting centerline rudder. Maybe that has been fed into that speed and range advantage. And it makes sense if they're factoring in range, and that actually is how that function works in the game. So if deployed operationally, Yamato can go no further than 6 hexes, whereas the Iowa can trot along to 8. And I think with all those factors considered, it is a fair rating. So, to conclude, I have said quite a lot about why I think that the two ships should be considered evenly matched. Yamato's always a difficult customer to assess because there are so many fans of this ship. Understandably, I am one myself. For all the negativity I've been throwing in her direction today, I think the Yamato class are brilliant, and I love them as much as I love the Iowas. But I think a parity across the board is probably the fairest way of treating them. Although I will grant the game gets it right by giving the Iowa much greater anti-aircraft capability. I would want their main armament ratings to be equivalent. But I hope that you have found this interesting. And no, I'm not going to go down the route of saying who I think would have won a battle. I think there's been so many debates about how that would go that my voice in among them is probably a bit superfluous, really. And it's one of those questions I suspect we will never ever satisfactorily answer. So apologies if that causes any disappointment, but I will leave it there. As always, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for following this series. Those of you who've been watching Ships of War, I really hope you've enjoyed it so far. I do welcome suggestions as to what to do next. I may not be able to act on all of them, either because of a lack of information or simply lack of an appropriate game that allows me to match up the suggested combatants. But if you put in those suggestions, I will always do my best to comply. I've really enjoyed putting this video together, as I have all the others. And so before I sign off, it'll just be with the usual thank you for your company. Always good to see my veterans and indeed any newcomers. If this is your first foray into Ships of War, welcome to the series. And whatever's brought you here, I hope I'll see you again soon. Thank you very much for tuning in. Bye.